if your peaking plan is just cutting volume and adding some heavy singles leading into the meet, then you're probably leaving a lot on the table in terms of pounds on your total at the meet. And your own training log is already going to have the data that you need to go from your training currently to actually putting together the biggest possible total. And it's going to do you a whole lot better than using a peaking program that you found online. And it also takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. So in today's episode, Zach and I are going to go through breaking down the actual process when we're working with lifters who are getting ready for their meets and how we actually look at training data so that we can build a peak that's actually built around how you specifically respond to volume and intensity and specific movements instead of just taking a stab in the dark.
Yeah. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
most
Go ahead.
people do yeah, sorry. Most
Yeah.
people don't have a coach that's pulling their data. There is a lot of different stuff that goes into it, though, including just like the analytical side of things, understanding what the training data suggests, understanding what each number means in terms of the overall projection. What does your E1RM mean? What does your stress index mean? So, in your opinion, Matt, like what are people actually doing on that side of things?
So I basically see two different paths, right? You'll have one kind of lifter where they'll just run, whatever's popular. So they'll do uh, conjugate might not be the best, or conjugates West Side style programs, and then they'll do maybe even something like 5-3-1 or uh, some sort of bodybuilding inspired training where they're just like pushing, fives or a 5x5 program. And then they'll just like train into the meet and cross their fingers and go do some singles on meet day. They're like, I don't know, this is probably where my max is. And I have actually a lot of positive sentiment around that and just train up to the meet and go hit some heavy singles and keep it simple. Like, especially if you're starting to compete, uh, don't make it too complicated. Like nobody's going to care if you win the open local powerlifting competition. It's like a fundraiser for whatever. Like it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
You can just go lift weights and have a good time. But then I'll see the other side where lifters will put together this big, super complicated, like 12-week undulating period is like, and there's like 500 different levels of detail with the program that they either found online in some like peaking program for powerlifting first competition that they Googled, or they had like an AI app. I actually started working with two lifters this month that were both using AI to write their programs. And like, there's some good elements in there, but everyone forgets that it's like a language model. It's just going to give you like what's the most likely next word. And there are some cursed things in those programs when I look at that. Um, but yeah, effectively, the problem that comes with especially those like very specific, complicated peaking programs is, and you can read even like the best books. If you want to go and read like the Shako books, there's like 15 programs in the back of that book, and they talk about all kinds of different peaking models and how to alternate and undulate the volume across the different weeks to time the peak. But what a lot of people forget with that is that those are basically sample programs for a lifter that's been built over weeks, months, and years. And they all really started from some kind of template. And then over time, they get iterated on within a system to arrive at this, what looks like very complicated end result, where I don't think any of us can pick out, well, here's exactly why the volume is highest on week 3 and week 8, but not on week 7, for example, or whatever it may be, or why don't they even use a linear model or whatever it may be. And it's because all those programs just get built around the lifter with a coach who's paying attention, as opposed to like arbitrarily adding 50 layers of complexity. Real quick, I've been coaching powerlifting since 2012. And in my time coaching, I've produced over 50 medals and helped lifters set multiple national records now. So if you're looking for help prepping for your next meet in terms of hitting the biggest possible PRs and having confidence with a predictable plan that gives you the results you're looking for on meet day, you can click the link in the podcast description down below. We'll talk about what working together would look like, involving putting together a customized plan that's suited to your lifestyle, your training goals, and your goals with the meet in a way that integrates with the rest of your life. Back to the episode.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then, especially when the lifters will do that, they'll get to a point where they're like, all right, I'm prepping for my first meet. I've signed up. I'm 12 weeks out. And they're like, all right, well, I guess I need to go and like hit some heavy singles. I'm going to go find a peaking program. And then they keep doing these random programs. And like, sometimes they work, especially off season where you've got a lot of ways you can progress and a lot of ways to measure progress. Like you can progress and it's okay, but they get sort of bottlenecked effectively, like as they get closer to the meet, where they're like, sometimes it works, but also because there's all these little individualizations that have been added, sometimes they're just like, I am 3 weeks out and I missed my second last warm up. Help. And it's
Yeah.
too late at that point.
It's almost like there's this assumption that because it has worked for somebody else in the past, it's automatically going to work for me. And it's like, well, that other person could be a 300-pound super heavyweight, and it's like a super low volume setup versus like I am somebody who's 160 pounds and I'm very well built for an individual lift, and I actually need like a lot of volume and stimulation. And when you're going through these rabbit holes of these different online programs, you miss out on the specificity of that then. And while it may seem specific because it may have you doing a lot of like squat, bench, and deadlift without variation, you miss the individual needs. You miss the individual things, like what made it work for that person, and why would it work or not work for me as an individual.
Yeah. And you brought up a great point there with some lifters being like well built, well leveraged for a lift. In that, like, especially with higher frequency movements or higher frequency training, that's popular enough these days. Like a lot of lifters, I think, will gravitate towards. I don't see a lot of people squatting less than twice a week, for example, or benching less than 3 times a week, unless they're super old school. But like, maybe you're not super well built for that, or maybe like how you have to go through frequency gets adjusted with like how specific is that frequency. So, like, I'll give an example for myself. I have a positive 2 ape index, like and I have tiny hands, so it's all
Yeah.
arms. Uh, but for me, like my arms are quite long. It's not like I have super short forearms either. So, like, my bench range of motion, especially being lighter now, is quite big. And so, while I am benching 4 days a week, um, half of my bench slots are not, they don't really look like benching or like comp benching, because when I do that, I just get so ragged so fast. And like, I can't get through a block, even if I'm sandbagging intensities, deliberately going easier on some days. Like, I just get so beat up from like consistently being in a, I don't want to say poorly leveraged, but not optimally leveraged position in the bottom of that bench, that I get so banged up. And like, it should work, if I can survive the training, but the reality is I can't. And so I need to find those ways to adjust, knowing, okay, like I feel good when I have higher frequency, but like, how do I have to adjust that to make that strategy work within the system?
And that's a fantastic point because I'm a plus zero ape index. My wingspan is the same as my height. I bench 4 days per week, and I need a lot of. I don't think I've done a day that hasn't been competition bench. It might have been like a 3 count pause, but for the past year and a half, it has been comp bench on this day, comp bench on this day, comp bench on this day. Like the intensity will vary day to day, and we did a lot of. We were able to make a ton of progress, like very like middle of the road kind of intensity on those days, and now we're shifting towards a higher intensity on some of the secondary days. But that's like the perfect point where like my program would tear you up, and your program would kill my bench. It would drop by like 40 pounds probably.
Yeah. Yeah. There's quite a few things in my program where I'm like, this is not present in many of the programs that I write. And then on the flip side, like, I think I've talked about my emotional state when I know I'm onto a good program with like Emily, for example,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, so 2-time national bench record holder, right? And I almost always know I'm onto something good when I look at the program and I'm like, what the hell am I doing right now? Um, like, it's founded in data. Like, I know this is going to work well for her, and here's all the reasons why. But I'm looking at this on paper. I'm like, I know probably 5 people who could probably do this program and be okay with it, let alone do well. And I am not on that list for sure. And it's super individual. And I feel like this is where a lot of self-coach lifters run into problems, especially when they are trying to optimize for things and they are testing different variables and saying, okay, like, I'm aware that I can't just leap off a cliff and try this peaking program that's based on somebody else entirely. Like, it's a totally random guess if this works. I know I should be making smaller changes, right? I need to be more iterative to know, okay, well, if I keep all of this the same, my frequency the same, and this and that, and I just swap my pause squat for a front squat, right? Okay, that's one change. I got to run that for a block. And so you're like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, realistically, month and a half by the time you do a training block and a deload for most people. Okay. Assess if that worked compared to the last time I did a block that was similar. Then go into the next set of changes. Like, okay, well, does this movement work well for me if I train a bit more volume or a bit less volume? And so, like, going back to my example, like, I can beat the snot out of my triceps and it works really well for my bench. But if I try to take that same kind of volume and train regular benching, even with an adjusted frequency, I fall off. Right. And so it's like there's all these little levels of detail that we can get into. And when you're self coaching, you're going to be constrained by time every every single time. Whereas if you are, working with a coach, for example, you're able to leverage, especially if they've been doing it for a long time or worked with a lot of lifters successfully. If that coach is paying attention, they can find, hey, here's the type of lifter that's going to do well with this for these reasons. And if we're even boiling it down to like, all right, ape index, build for bench, here's some themes we're going to go through with frequency. And you can like fast track a lot of at least the learning and get into that power zone more quickly with like, this is productive and we're cooking more quickly as opposed to, well, let's test it and see. And then you also don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very similar to what we talked about last time with like just figuring out what works in the first place. Like understanding you're in the maze and there's like you can find your way through the maze a little bit. Um, the coach should already kind of have a good roadmap of it just based on other lifters that they've worked with, right? Like I've got 3 people right now who are off the top of my head, very upright, quad dominant squatters. And if you were to look at the way that I program them across, you know, 6 to 8 blocks, there's differences, but it's overall there's a clear theme going on where we're hammering high bar, and then we're incorporating a secondary day. We're limiting the secondary day intensity while we pump up the primary day intensity, and then kind of just do enough to feed the primary day. Um, and that's kind of the difference between going online, finding a program that was built out versus taking the information that you have from your existing training data and trying to extrapolate it out. Because at the end of the day, you can't just go from like a ton of volume to like, and this is the issue I see with a lot of like early intermediates or even like late stage intermediates. A lot of them try to go off of like the old school, like we're into a hypertrophy phase, a strength phase, a peaking phase. And while some aspects of that can work for certain people or for certain lifts within each individual, like we take a very similar approach to my squat when we're getting ready for a competition. Um, Overall, they're doing that while ignoring what is currently yielding good progress in training. And it's like if training's not working anyways, sure, why not? Give it a shot. But if you have a system that works, rather than trying to completely upend it and undermine your own progress by switching to this like idealized situation, you have to take the idealized like online program and try and fit it to what you're currently doing. If you're doing 5 sets of squat a week and this program that you're going to run gives you 10 sets of squat, guess what? You're not going to feel good, and that's one of the biggest issues we see is like people go from one extreme to the other extreme without thinking of that whole space in between.
Yeah. Yeah. I think everyone wants to focus on like the adaptation of like getting stronger, but then they ignore the other side of it, which is like if there's a detraining component too. Like you can't have everything be at its best all the time. And there's so many different traits that will contribute to your success with lifting, right? Like there's obviously strength, there's your ability to grind and sustain force over a longer period. There's your ability to hold position and more like technical components, the feeling things. Then we can get into, like rate of force development. Some lifters are very speed sensitive. And like when we get into grindy reps, that's an issue. So like training their ability to be explosive, super important, or, just overall work capacity. And so they end up trying to taper. I had one lifter, um, she actually just PR'd her bench last week. And one of the big changes we made is we had always kind of lightly had sort of a block style to her training where it's like, okay, we're going to have a pretty concurrent approach where like you're going to be taking top sets on your bench every week. But we're still going to have some like pretty high volume themes. And then we'll gradually kind of taper that down as you get closer. But especially with like lighter lifters or lifters who tend to like be able to hit really similar top sets week over week and not fizzle out in a block, I find that the more concurrent approach of like, hey, we're going to hit your top sets just as aggressively every week. And then we're going to have a floor to your volume where it's just like, we're going to supplement with all of your accessory work. We're going to make sure you get enough volume. And especially with those lifters who do really well with intensity, right? So with her, she hits uh, max doubles or triples twice a week on her bench. It's like work up to a top set of 2 or 3, depending on the block, on Monday and Friday at RPE 9 for near max, right? And when we started doing that, we noticed, okay, cool. Like you come up on week 2, you flatline on week 3, and then you have basically a PR guaranteed on the block. But we had one block where we said, okay, let's try to just bring your total volume down a little bit here. And we found that as soon as we got below about like 4,000 pounds of weekly bench volume, like on her main bench movements. So it's, what does she do? Close grip incline, bench versus spans, regular bench. And I think we have like a free slot in there that's kind of varies. Sometimes it's more overhead press focus. Sometimes it's dumbbell bench. Like it's kind of a pec or shoulder slot.
Yeah.
Um, and as soon as we got below about 4,000 pounds of combined volume, which for a low mid 100-pound bencher is a decent amount of volume still,
Yeah.
it was like immediate. It's just like, oh, you can't bench right now. Like you're barely making 95 pounds for a triple. Um, and then on the flip side, I've got some lifters who are pretty much the inverse. Like I have one guy where this is over COVID. He went to the hospital. He got hospitalized because of how bad he got COVID. And I suppose, function of deloading by not being in the gym and being on bed rest for like a week. He
Yeah.
came back and I'd given him like, all right, cool. Like I want you to work up to like a set of 5 at a 7 RPE. Like that's a super safe range for you. Let's just get your feet wet again. And he took his max at the time, which was 500, and he did it for 5 at RPE 7. I was like, so are we just going to give you COVID to prep for your next meet, or like what's the game plan here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's so not, like his floor was so low where he responded so much to volume for progression, and then we cut it out and he just surges up. It's so individual, and like knowing where those limits are, and there's no real way to know for sure without testing. But at the same time, if you're just taking those big swings all the time, there's so many other variables at play. And I think thankfully I've seen this in the online coaching space become a bit more, like the sentiments become more positive recently, where I wrote an article about this a long time ago, but like in defense of training templates,
Mhm.
like like you should have an extensive onboarding process to get to know an athlete to make an informed decision about where to start in your system. But it can't just be like, all right, nobody else's program looks like this on week 1, because like, how am I even going to measure what's working or the direction we want to go? Because we don't have any conditions. Like if this and that doesn't exist when I have no landmarks.
Yeah, and that's like the exact opposite end of the paradigm. It's like the people that are just running templates endlessly and kind of going from template to template that maybe don't have like a lot of, through lines and not a lot of crossovers, and they're wondering why things aren't working. There's the people on the opposite end of the spectrum who are like, I need this hyper specific approach to my thing and blah blah blah. And it's like, no, if you zoom out, like you're actually just doing like a regular like 5-3-1, bro. Like relax, it's okay. Um and that's like you said, it's not in total defense of like I'm not giving everybody the same program. There's a reason for that. I don't believe in coaches who have one program that they give to everybody. Like I have a lifter who is competing this upcoming weekend, and they went to a local gym, and like, oh, like that coach had everyone taking their openers and blah blah blah. And I'm like, why would they have everyone taking their openers when one of their clients is like a 45-year-old 90-pound woman, and another one is a 30-year-old, 220-pound guy? Like it just doesn't feel right to have those two people doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Um, so while we may not want to be on that one end where like everyone gets the same program, we also probably don't need a hyper specific approach to everybody to start out, to understand like what makes you feel strong on the day, and then how can we then capitalize on that? Because that's where a lot of people get lost in the sauce. It's like they're like, oh, I'm 12 weeks out, I'm starting my peaking program, and it's like, what is functionally different from what you were doing 12 weeks out from what you were doing 16 weeks out? I can't think of any lifter I have off the top of my head where we flip a switch like that and we like suddenly change everything. We might go from like high bar to low bar, but it's because we have data to suggest that doing the high bar in the first place was worth it for you. And then switching to low bar is going to yield a certain result.
Yeah. And I think when you're saying data, you're specifically looking at like the transference, right? Of when we do high bar, we see your rep PRs or your, 1 rep max, your projected max go up on your low bar squat, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we have historical data, number one, to say that like high bar will probably make your competition squat better. But number two, even before getting that historical data, I had a reason to put high bar there in the first place, whether it was like, hey, we need to just like hammer your quads because we don't have a lot of like quad specific work, or maybe we need to give your like hips and back a break. So we're doing high bar after your sumo deadlift so that you have a day where you're not doing a ton of work and loading those tissues. Or maybe you're just a squatty squatter. And it's like we could probably just benefit from that. Like there was a reason to do it in the first place. We ran through a cycle and now we have that cycle to suggest, okay, this is what the data is showing. This is how we're probably going to be able to transition you closer to the competition and yield some results. We're taking what has worked, a very golden microcycle kind of mindset, and applying it a little more long term out to like several blocks of like, this is what your off season looked like. And now this is what your competition block is going to look like. And that's why there is that transitional phase.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I think you should be like, look at the data in front of you, look at that recent data, because that's going to be the most relevant, I think, in terms of, okay, what's my next move, right? Because it's recent and you should be adapting and changing as an athlete if you're doing things even remotely okay. Um, like adaptation is the point of what we're doing. So don't lose sight of that. But then also make sure that still fits into a bit of a plan, like have the 2 or 3 steps forward. And I think you can gain just as much insight on, okay, well, we did high bar because our idea was as a squatter, you're probably going to do really well with your technique, your build, how the training program is set up within the system, more quad work. But at the end of the block, you can't just be like, all right, well, we did high bar squats, so now we're going to go do low or leg press or whatever, more quad work. It's like, no, like sit down and look at it and take a look. Did it carry over? Right. And like, I've got one lifter where like everything suggested for them, like your back just needs to be stronger. Like it's unconditionally, like you're not built to squat. You get super forward in your squat, and that's the only way you're going to hit depth. It is what it is. And we tried it. Like we had done more back work, and we just watched nothing happen with their squat. Their bench got really good because they got like thicker, and their bench range of
Yeah, yeah,
motion
yeah.
got reduced. But like nothing changed with their squat. And I'm like, all right, cool. Well, I guess not that. Let's go the other route and just work your quads more. And lo and behold, and this is not to say that quads are the solution to everybody's squat, but if it was as simple as like, oh, this is the idea, I'm just going to go do that. Like, why even call it an experiment? Why not just write the next 42 weeks of your program? Right. And so I feel like when we're getting into, okay, lifter's gone from, I've been getting stronger. I want to get specific on competing for a powerlifting meet. Like if I'm not supposed to use a template or Google peaking program, what the heck am I supposed to do? I think the single thing you have to do is say, okay, well, I have all this data, assuming you haven't here, if you've been tracking it in the notes app on your phone, as much as that makes me cry, at least you have data to work from and you can parse it into something usable. But uh, go back to whatever notes you have, right? Because and the more detailed those are, even if it's like sets, reps, and RPE, that's a great place to start from, right? And so I feel like number one is just taking a look at some training blocks and see, okay, start to end of block, were there any periods over the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months where I noticeably saw a big surge in my projected max or a bunch of rep PRs back to back where I just felt like I was on fire. I had a really good rhythm. And if you can get to like the data nitty gritty, super useful. But it can also just be like, I felt like I was on a really good roll with training. If you don't have the very data based notes and you are tracking a little more like on your phone and your notes are mostly vibe based. And then starting to look into some of the themes, right? what are the big things you look at, Zach, when you're starting to go through those notes and say, okay, like we've been getting stronger, but we didn't really have the data to work from necessarily. Like I'm 6 months into working with an athlete now. I've collected a lot of data,
Mhm.
and now we've got to meet in 4 months. How are you going to go piece that together? Like, what are the big things you're looking at?
So the first thing I'm looking at is like within the training cycle. This is time to functionally what I'm going to say is time to peak, right? When do they feel the strongest? When does bar speed start to pick up? When do they start to feel beat up? Do they feel aches and pains at different phases? And that almost will lead you to like what is the maximum length of time that we have to get ready for the competition, right? Because I'm not going to have somebody who they're dragging themselves across the finish line at week 5. I'm probably not going to try and be super intense with them until the week of the competition if I know that like that beat up time is when they're actually strong. So the thing that I always say when I'm like talking to Sean is like week 1 and week 2 on any given block, it's a scratch. It's useless data. It doesn't tell us anything. I feel terrible on week 1. Week 2, I'm just kind of getting my body underneath me. And then week 3, everything shows up. Everything feels fast. Everything feels strong. And I can keep that up until like week 5 and like burn out fast after that. So we don't go beyond a week 5. Um, so that's the first thing is understanding when does that paradigm shift? Um, and what kind of leads into it? Because I think psychologically, for a lot of lifters, if they're 5 weeks out and they're in my situation where like week 1, they just don't feel good, or week 2, they don't feel good. If they don't know that, if they don't have that data, if they don't have those notes, it's good for me as the coach to say, hey, we see historically, typically week 1 and week 2 are a wash. We can ignore them. It's not going to feel good. And that's kind of the language I use when I'm talking to the athlete in that kind of scenario where I'm like, it's not going to feel good. And that's okay because we know it never feels good. As long as it doesn't feel worse than usual, as long as you're not like actively hurting, like tying your shoes, we're probably okay. Um, Beyond that, though, it's understanding what's the interplay between each lift. Bench is usually kind of its own thing. It's usually riding by itself, but there are lifters where we put their deadlift at the front of the week because if they try to deadlift after doing like if they have like a week 2 deadlift after a week 2 squat, we know that deadlift is going to be hampered even further. And if they're somebody who is already on like a very low volume kind of setup, we're not going to be able to taper them a ton because we don't have much to taper from. So we need to prioritize predictability at that point. We put the deadlift at the front of the week and we say, hey, like your squat's probably not going to feel as good, but we know that. Um, so it's parsing through number one, when do they feel the strongest? When do they feel the worst? Getting them to understand that because they don't feel great, it doesn't mean that they're cooked. It's not like, everything's lost. And then number two, understanding when each lift within that cycle has that shift and how we can, capitalize on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the idea of, okay, like figure out the timing of when this training happens first. Right. I think when we are working backwards from an end date, as opposed to just generally trying to get stronger, we do need to look at, okay, this is the deadline. We need to work backwards from there. Right. Much in the same way as, it takes you 36 minutes to drive to work and you need 9 minutes to get your shoes on and let the engine warm up. Like you're going to need to give yourself like 45 minutes plus 5 minutes of buffer to get there. Right. Well, we got to do the same thing with a meet when we're trying to time performance on a specific day and finding, okay, will you come up at week 5? Right. And when we push to week 6, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. I'm going to go for the sure thing. I'll take week 5 and we work backwards from there. Right. Um, and then organizing that timing also more at like a weekly level as well. Okay. Well, within this, between each lift, what's the interplay, especially squat deadlift, right? Especially if you're poorly leveraged, conventional deadlift and long femur squatter, like, oh baby, we are gonna be looking at those and how often we push them closely together, right? The other thing that I look at as well is at a volume level, because I think the next lever we can pull is just workload, right? And going back to those notes and saying, okay, well, here's those periods that tended to work well. It looks like, okay, I came up at week 5 in the block. Like, well, it was kind of like the average amount of work that I was doing per week. And you can calculate volume. I think there's pros and cons to that, but you can also just simply go with like, hey, how many tough-ish sets am I doing per week? Like assuming you're not having some weeks where it's RPE 10 and some weeks where it's RPE 5, you can probably count everything from like a 7 up to a 10. And that's going to give you at least a ballpark of like, hey, yeah, roughly speaking, this is kind of how much volume that I seem to progress well on. And then that starts to give you, you've got your when, then you've got your how much, right? The what is obviously just your lifts, right? So we don't need to solve for that. And who is you, hopefully. Um, but once we go for that, then we can look into one more level of detail below that of, okay, is there any confounding factors in there? Like when I do belt squats, for example, like my squat blows up and I actually get a lot of progression, especially with like the weird homebrew belt squat I've built. It,
Yeah.
dude, it's so good. I like don't even want to use a pitch shark or even the Rhino. I'm like, it's
Yeah,
okay
yeah,
at this point. Like, give me my belt squat built out of plywood and 2x6. I
yeah.
prefer it. Um, but that's a side quest for a different day. But my groove on heavier squats just feels super goofy. And so I'm willing to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to try to do most of my like gain on squat and get my base as strong as possible up to the last block before I peak. And then I'm going to add some more skill specific work where I might not come up as much, but I can like hone the blade and refine the skill. And I've got like one lifter I work with, he just took his first 200 kilo squat in January. And then he took 210 at like an RPE 9 in June. So late March, early April, he took 210 at like easily sub max. And one of the big things we found with him is he actually gets quite a bit stronger when we're doing sets of like 5, 6, like very middle intensity responder. And he gets super beat up. Like we are on a very limited timeline when we start doing singles. And so like leading up to that prep, he had, I think, 2 reps of squatting above or three reps of squatting in the whole prep above 400 pounds leading up to 440. Right. And so for him, we say, hey, you know what? If you are a volume responder, like try to stay to that as much as you can. And then just pull like 1 or 2 sets out and add 1 or 2 singles to just build the groove that you need with some, so pull 1 or 2 working sets and then add in 1 or 2 singles just to have the skill component. Right. And that goes back to those traits we were talking about of like, well, there's hypertrophy, there's metabolic components, there's base levels of strength with different rep ranges. And then there's the skill of doing singles. And that's where I feel like, especially in those lifters that, like myself, frankly, get really beat up really fast when I'm taking singles or, anything that's not a warm up single, basically. I get beat up quickly, not over prioritizing the skill too early because then you just get too beat up to do the rest of the training and saying,
Well, this
okay,
is
well, I
cool
know
because
that. Yeah.
this is a good example of where we might actually differ a little bit because if I have a lifter who gets beat up, I won't even give them singles in a competition block. And there's multiple people at this point that I've had where like Johnny's a very squatty squatter. We never give him singles when he's getting ready for a competition because he will gas himself out so much. I don't know if part of it's probably like the mental side of like, oh, I'm going to squat this. But like his past 2 meets where he's added like 40 pounds to his squat, we didn't do a single for either of those preps. And then Tess is on the opposite end of the spectrum, very like hinge dominant, very long femur squatter. We had them doing triples just because like they needed enough weight on the back, but we hadn't done a lot of like high intensity stuff in general. And we're already at a point where we're hitting near 3 rep max values. We Your 3 rep max is already like 90% of your 1 rep max. We probably don't even need more than that anyways. So we had like a 3 week competition block and added like 10 keys to their 1 rep max. I think they were from like 170 to 180. And good for 200 on the day. Very obviously good for like 200 on the day. Like it was a joke and we hadn't touched a single.
And that's very much like, so it's like JR's deadlift, right? Like he just seems to be able to not touch anything. And then like when he needs to, it, the lift is there. Like and I find deadlift especially is like this, where you just don't really need to, with most lifters, like pull heavy all the time. Like they just sort of get it. They can just focus, go get tight, lift. Um, and that's like with that meet prep, I didn't do any singles with JR. right? Because we found that, hey, your technique is fine, but we were finding it was just an absolute roll of the dice on if he would rock back onto his heels and have his ass shoot up when he got over 90% basically on his squat. And so we said, okay, like we definitely need more skill practice because at the very least, you're just not confident in this. And if I'm loading some milestone number, like you're very good at focusing, but I think you're probably not going to be able to focus past that because we've tried it a couple times and we're finding like, your squat does get a little goofy if you don't have some skill practice. What's the minimum amount of skill practice we need to get that? Because when we do the singles, like training just doesn't really progress at a base level, right? Like the floor isn't really coming up. We're just inching the ceiling up a little bit.
Yeah.
And that I feel like is a really big difference for those lifters. And hey, there are some lifters, like going back to the Emily example, she does singles like twice a week, pretty much year round.
Yeah, yeah.
I've had blocks where I think I put top sets on all 4 of her days.
That's disgusting.
Dude, the survivability trait it's like at 11. It's insane. Uh, and you know, every lifter is going to have their pros and cons with the skill tree, right? But yeah, it's crazy. But I think really it's about knowing, okay, like what can your body tolerate? Do you progress really well with like higher volume or lower volume styles of approaches? Are there movements that work well for you? Start to quantify that. And then you can deal with all those edge cases we talked about later. But I think big buckets that you can work with is like, look, if you're generally doing really well with higher volume programs and you feel beat up with like more like high intensity type approaches, like triples, double singles, maybe don't build the bulk of your prep around that, right? Just like switch over when you need to. And then if you need some skill work, do some skill work, do some singles, do some that kind of stuff. But just because one lifter needs it doesn't, or you need it on one lift even, doesn't mean you're going to need it on all of them, right? And then as you do more meets, iterate on that, right? And you're like, well, I was actually starting to feel a little too beat up to really perform well on the day. I'm actually going to, instead of doing 4 weeks of singles, I'm going to do 3 weeks of singles and just have the last 3 weeks be singles. And don't be afraid to be wrong, right? Because there is no single answer with any of this. It has to be iterative, and you have to be willing to kind of grow and make mistakes and find what doesn't work just as much as what does work in that process, or at least be willing to find what doesn't work in pursuit of finding what does.
Yeah, and on the same note, that's not grasping at straws either, you know? If you're gonna try a new approach, base it off of what you already understand, and if it doesn't work, you go back to closer to where you were starting at as opposed to reaching further out.
Yeah, 100%. Anything else you want to add before we close this one up? Fantastic. All right. So if you do have a bunch of training notes and you're looking at this, you listen to this podcast episode, like first of all, congratulations for listening to Zach and I yap for like 40 minutes at this point. I applaud you. But if you do have a bunch of data and you're like, I don't really know where to start with this, all you can do is you can click the link down in the video description and it'll link you to a forum to get in touch with me directly. And what I'll do is for free, I'll help you go through your training notes and find the blocks that work best for you, what works well for the trends, give you some suggestions around how, if I were you, I'd peak for a meet and help you to put together a game plan on how to approach your next meet prep. Thanks all, Zach.